A bridge in one of China's poorest provinces now holds the world record for height. The drop from its deck to the river below is 625 meters. It was built in under 4 years. This is the story of how that happened, and what it actually cost to make it happen. The bridge crosses a canyon in Guizhou, a province where the average income sits roughly 40% below the national figure. 90% of its land is mountain and cliff. For most of its history, this terrain kept Guizhou economically isolated. A farmer could see the next village across a gorge and still need half a day to reach it. In most economies, that combination, difficult terrain, low income, minimal private investment, would be the end of the story. Nobody builds a record-breaking bridge in a place too poor to justify one. But Guizhou runs on a different set of incentives entirely. Local officials in China are evaluated and promoted based on measurable output, economic growth, kilometers of new road, infrastructure completed. A record-setting bridge becomes a career achievement, not just a construction project. That alone creates pressure to build. But it doesn't explain where the money comes from. Provincial governments in China generally cannot borrow directly from banks at this scale, so a workaround emerged. Local governments create financing companies, transfer land into them, and those companies borrow from state banks on the government's behalf. These vehicles now number in the thousands nationwide, and state banks continue lending to them under a shared assumption that Beijing will not allow them to fail. Combine that financing structure with a government that already owns the land it needs, no lengthy legal disputes over property rights, and construction moves at a pace that would be structurally impossible almost anywhere else. The result, in Guizhou alone, is more than 30,000 bridges. Engineers have taken to calling the province a living museum of bridge engineering. The consequences are real and immediate. A crossing that once took 2 hours on switchback mountain roads now takes 2 minutes. A province that was economically isolated is now within an hour of tens of millions of people. But this same system has a cost that doesn't show up in the ribbon-cutting photos. In August of a recent year, a partially built railway bridge collapsed in Qinghai province, killing 12 construction workers. In a single summer, more than 100 people died in incidents involving roads and bridges elsewhere in the country, some of them only a few years old. There's a term in Chinese that's come to describe this specific failure mode: construction using substandard, corner-cut materials, poured too quickly and inspected too loosely. The phrase traces back to a flood in 1998, when a senior official inspected a collapsed levee and compared its concrete to the soft, crumbling leftovers of tofu production. The comparison stuck, and it's remained in use for every subsequent failure that fits the same pattern, including a 2008 earthquake where thousands of schoolchildren died in classrooms built with rebar so thin it should never have passed inspection. Investigations into exactly where the money for proper materials went were, in several documented cases, cut short. The financial cost tells its own version of this story. Independent estimates from international monitors place the debt hidden inside these local financing vehicles at approximately $9 trillion, separate from, and on top of, China's official national debt figure. Guizhou's provincial debt alone is estimated at roughly 3/4 of everything the province produces economically in a year. The country's high-speed rail network, now longer than every other nation's combined, carries a similar hidden weight. The state railway operator's debt is estimated at roughly $860 billion. Most of that network's individual lines don't generate enough revenue to cover their own operating costs. Some newly built stations, constructed for towns that never grew into their projected size, have simply been shut down since opening. So why hasn't this system collapsed under its own weight? Because nearly all of the debt is owed in the country's own currency, from state-owned companies to state-owned banks. The lender and the borrower ultimately answer to the same authority. When a provincial financing vehicle runs into trouble, that debt often gets quietly restructured rather than allowed to default, because there's no outside creditor with the leverage to force a reckoning. The bet underlying all of it was never that the concrete would generate direct returns. The bet was that connectivity itself, new roads, new rail, new access, would eventually generate growth somewhere else in the economy, indirectly, over time. For 2 decades, in the highest impact projects, that bet largely paid off. What's changed is which projects are left to build. The first bridge across an isolated canyon can transform an entire region's economy. The 10th bridge, built after every major population center is already connected, increasingly transforms only a balance sheet. The machine that built the highest bridge on Earth in under 4 years didn't do it through better engineering alone. It did it by inventing a financial structure that could ignore risks most systems are specifically designed to price in. A bet that so far has mostly worked, on a scale where mostly now means trillions of dollars, and, in the worst cases, human lives.